From Vikings to a legend far darker. He didn't say it. He ruled through fear and impaled thousands to prove it. Forget vampires. The real Vlad Dracula didn't need fangs, he had spikes. In the 15th century, while Europe trembled at stories of his cruelty, one man turned brutality into an art form. This is the story of a prince who became a monster not through supernatural curse, but through cold calculation and desperate necessity. His name was Vlad the Impaler. He ruled a small kingdom caught between two empires. And his solution to impossible odds was simple: make his enemies too terrified to fight. The forest of impaled bodies around his capital became his signature. The screams of his victims became his weapon. But was he a bloodthirsty tyrant, drunk on power, or exactly what his dying kingdom needed to survive? The answer lies buried in the blood-soaked earth of medieval Wallachia. A boy learned that in a world without mercy, mercy itself becomes a form of suicide. This is the true story of Dracula, not the vampire of fiction, but the man who was far more terrifying than any creature of the night. In the fortress of Saigiowara, perched on a hill overlooking the Trunava River, a child was born into a world where survival was measured in betrayals per decade. His name was Vlad Dracula III, and his birthplace was the perfect symbol of his destiny, a fortress built to withstand siege in a land that was always under siege. Wallachia. The name itself means land of the Vlachs, a region that had never known peace, never known security, never known the luxury of choosing its own destiny. Stretched between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River, it was an agricultural paradise cursed by its location at the crossroads of empires. To the south, across the Danube, lay the Ottoman Empire, an Islamic colossus that had swallowed Byzantium, Serbia, Bulgaria, and most of the Balkans. The Ottomans were not just conquerors, they were transformers. They took Christian boys to make them into Muslim soldiers, turned churches into mosques, and replaced local laws with Islamic jurisprudence. To the north, Hungary represented Christian Europe's last bastion against Islamic expansion. But Hungary was no benevolent protector. Hungarian lords saw Wallachia as a buffer zone, useful for absorbing Ottoman attacks and profitable for extracting tribute. They would support any Wallachian prince who served their interests and destroy any who didn't. Between these two titans, Wallachia was like a mouse between two cats. Survival meant never being noticed by either for too long. The principality's wealth came from its fertile plains that produced grain for export and its position controlling trade routes between Europe and Asia. But this same wealth made it a target for every empire that needed resources. The mathematics of survival were brutal, a tribute to the Ottomans, and the Hungarians would call you a traitor to Christianity. Ally with Hungary, and Ottoman armies would reduce your cities to ash. Try to play both sides, and you might live long enough to see your sons taken as hostages and your nobles plotting your assassination. Into this impossible situation was born Vlad Dracula II, the father of our story's protagonist. He was not a weak man or a coward. He was a realist who understood that idealism was a luxury his kingdom couldn't afford. Vlad Dracula II made a choice that would define his son's life. He joined the Order of the Dragon, founded by Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund. The order was a Christian military brotherhood dedicated to fighting the Ottoman Empire. Its members swore oaths to defend the faith and protect Christian lands from Islamic conquest. The dragon symbol was meant to represent the defeat of Satan, the great dragon of Revelation. Members wore dragon medallions and took the title Dracul, meaning dragon in Romanian. It was a mark of honor, a sign that the wearer had committed his life to holy war. But the Order of the Dragon was more than a religious organization. It was a political alliance. Joining meant access to Hungarian military support, trade agreements, and diplomatic recognition. For a small principality like Wallachia, membership was essential for survival. Yet even as Vlad Dracula II wore the dragon medallion, he also paid tribute to Sultan Murad II. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was survival. The Ottoman Empire demanded acknowledgement of their supremacy, regular payments of gold, and hostages to ensure loyalty. Refusing meant invasion, and invasion meant the end of Wallachia as an independent principality. Young Vlad grew up watching his father navigate these impossible waters. He saw how every decision carried the potential for catastrophe, how every alliance created new enemies, how every victory planted the seeds of future defeat. The boy learned that in his world, there were no permanent friends, no lasting victories, and no safety in half measures. The lesson was reinforced daily. Wallachian nobles who had grown rich trading with both Ottomans and Hungarians plotted against any prince who threatened their profits. The Orthodox Church preached submission to God while secretly negotiating with whoever offered the best terms. Merchants changed their loyalties with the seasons, and peasants supported whoever could protect them from the current threat. In 1436, Vlad was 5 years old. His father was forced to suppress a rebellion supported by Hungarian gold. The rebels were impaled outside Tergovite as a warning to others. It was young Vlad's first lesson in the effectiveness of public terror. 3 years later, Ottoman armies invaded Wallachia in response to his father's support for a Hungarian crusade. Villages were burned, populations enslaved, and the capital itself was threatened. Vlad Dracula II survived only by publicly renewing his submission to the Sultan. But the most formative lesson came in 1442 when Vlad was 11 years old. Sultan Murad II, suspicious of his Wallachian vassal's loyalty, demanded proof of continued allegiance. The price was simple: Vlad Dracula II must send his 2 younger sons to the Ottoman court as hostages. The decision tore the family apart. Vlad's mother begged her husband to refuse, to flee to Hungary, to find another way. But Vlad Dracula II understood the mathematics of power better than his wife. Refusing meant certain invasion. Fleeing meant abandoning his kingdom to chaos. The only choice was to sacrifice his sons for the possibility of preserving his throne. On a cold morning in November 1442, 11-year-old Vlad and his 9-year-old brother Radu were handed over to Ottoman officials at Giurgiu on the banks of the Danube. They would not see their homeland again for 6 years. As their boat crossed the river toward Ottoman territory, Vlad looked back at the receding shore of Wallachia. He had learned his first and most important lesson. In a world without mercy, love itself becomes a weapon that your enemies can use against you. The Ottoman court at Edirne was unlike anything the 2 Wallachian boys had ever seen. Where their father's court was a rough fortress designed for defense, the Ottoman palace was a sophisticated center of learning, culture, and administration. It was here that the empire's elite were trained, where future governors learned statecraft, and where the sons of conquered peoples were transformed into loyal servants of the Sultan. The palace school was not a prison, it was the most advanced educational institution in Europe. The brightest minds of the Islamic world taught mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and literature. Students learned Arabic, Persian, and Turkish alongside their native languages. They studied the Quran and Islamic law, but also classical Greek texts and Persian poetry. But the real curriculum was power. Students learned how the Ottoman Empire had grown from a small Turkish principality to a world-spanning empire in less than 2 centuries. They studied the techniques of administration that allowed a few thousand Ottoman officials to govern millions of subjects. They learned the military innovations that had made Ottoman armies invincible on 3 continents. Most importantly, they learned the Ottoman philosophy of governance, that diversity was strength, that loyalty could be engineered, and that fear was the most reliable foundation for order. The empire's success came not from forcing conformity, but from creating systems that made rebellion impossible and collaboration profitable. Young Radu thrived in this environment. He was charming, intelligent, and adaptable. He learned Turkish quickly, made friends among the other hostages, and showed genuine interest in Islamic culture. His teachers praised his progress, and he began to see the Ottoman Empire not as his captor but as his opportunity. Vlad was different. He excelled at military training, showing natural talent for strategy and tactics. He learned languages quickly and demonstrated keen intelligence in his studies. But he never forgot that he was a prisoner, never stopped planning his eventual return to Wallachia, never allowed himself to be seduced by Ottoman culture. The difference became clear in 1444, when news arrived that their father had joined a Hungarian crusade against the Ottoman Empire. While Radu worried about their safety as hostages, Vlad felt a savage pride that his father had finally chosen a side. The boy understood that this decision might cost him his life, but he respected the courage it represented. The Battle of Varna in November 1444 ended the last great Christian crusade against the Ottoman Empire. The Hungarian and Polish armies were annihilated, and the Ottoman position in the Balkans became unassailable. For most Europeans, Varna represented the end of hope for pushing back Islamic expansion. But for Vlad, the battle provided a different lesson. He studied the Ottoman victory not as a tragedy but as a masterclass in military effectiveness. He learned how superior discipline could overcome superior numbers, how psychological warfare could break enemy morale before the battle began, how controlling information could turn enemy strengths into weaknesses. The Ottoman military machine was built on systematic terror applied with surgical precision. Cities that surrendered were spared and protected. Cities that resisted were destroyed so completely that their names became warnings to others. The empire's reputation for merciless retaliation made most campaigns unnecessary. Enemies surrendered before fighting because they knew resistance meant annihilation. This was the lesson that would define Vlad's later career. Terror was not a byproduct of conquest but a tool of statecraft. Used correctly, it could eliminate the need for actual violence. Used incorrectly, it was merely sadism. The difference between a successful ruler and a tyrant was not the presence or absence of brutality, but its strategic application. Vlad also learned the importance of loyalty systems. The Ottoman Empire's greatest strength was its ability to turn enemies into allies, to create new elites from conquered populations, to build institutions that made rebellion unprofitable. The Janissaries who formed the empire's military backbone were recruited from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained to be more loyal to the Sultan than his own Turkish subjects. This system worked because it offered advancement to those who embraced it and destruction to those who resisted. It created a meritocracy where ability mattered more than birth, where an Albanian peasant's son could become a grand vizier, where a Wallachian hostage could rise to command armies. But the system also revealed its weakness to those who studied it carefully. It depended on the continued success of the empire, on the availability of new conquests to fund expansion, on the loyalty of converted populations who might remember their origins. Most importantly, it required absolute obedience to the Sultan, a single point of failure that could bring down the entire structure. By 1446, 14-year-old Vlad had learned everything the Ottoman Empire could teach him. He understood their strengths and their weaknesses, their methods and their limitations. He had studied their greatest victories and their rare defeats. He knew how they thought, how they planned, how they reacted to different threats. But unlike his brother Radu, who had begun to see himself as an Ottoman, Vlad never forgot who he was. He was the son of Vlad Dracula II, heir to the throne of Wallachia and future defender of Christian Europe. Every lesson he learned, every skill he developed, every friendship he made was preparation for his eventual return home. The boy who had entered the Ottoman palace as a hostage was transforming into something far more dangerous, an enemy who understood his opponents better than they understood themselves. November 1447. The news arrived at the Ottoman palace like a thunderbolt. Vlad Dracula II was dead, murdered by Hungarian-backed nobles who had grown tired of his attempts to balance between empires. The dragon was dead, and with him died the last hope of peaceful coexistence between Christian and Islamic powers in the Balkans. The murder was not a simple assassination but a carefully planned political revolution. Hungarian-backed boyars had invited Vlad Dracula II to a feast, then killed him and his eldest son Mircea in a massacre that eliminated the entire pro-Ottoman faction at the Wallachian court. The message was clear: Wallachia would align with Christian Europe, regardless of the consequences. But the conspirators had miscalculated. They had assumed that removing Vlad Dracula II would automatically bring Wallachia into the Hungarian sphere of influence. Instead, they had created a succession crisis that threatened to tear the principality apart. In the Ottoman palace, 15-year-old Vlad received the news with characteristic silence. While other hostages wept for their murdered relatives, Vlad showed no emotion. He had learned that grief was a luxury he couldn't afford, that emotion was information that enemies could use against him. But inside, the boy was calculating. His father's murder had eliminated the moderate faction that sought accommodation with both empires. The pro-Hungarian nobles had shown their strength by successful regicide. The pro-Ottoman faction had been decapitated. This left a power vacuum that someone would have to fill. Sultan Murad II faced his own calculations. The murder of his vassal was an insult that demanded response, but launching a major invasion would require resources he needed for other campaigns. The solution was elegant: use the dead prince's son as a puppet ruler, backed by Ottoman military support. Vlad was summoned to the Sultan's presence and given a choice that was not really a choice. He could return to Wallachia with Ottoman backing, claim his father's throne, and rule as a loyal vassal, or he could remain a hostage forever, watching his homeland be absorbed into the empire. The decision revealed everything about Vlad's character. A wiser man might have refused, understanding that accepting Ottoman support would make him a traitor in the eyes of his own people. A more cautious man might have delayed, hoping for better options. But Vlad was neither wise nor cautious. He was desperate to return home, regardless of the price. In October 1448, 17-year-old Vlad Dracula III crossed the Danube with a small Ottoman army and marched on Tergovite. The boy who had left as a hostage was returning as a conqueror, backed by the enemies of his faith and his people. The irony was not lost on the Wallachian nobles. The son of the dragon had returned under the banner of the Crescent. The heir to a Christian throne was supported by Islamic armies. The prince who should have been defending Europe was serving as an Ottoman puppet, but Vlad had learned from his father's mistakes. He understood that ideological purity was a luxury that dead princes could afford. The living had to make compromises, had to choose between survival and principle, had to accept that in a world without perfect choices, the least bad option was often the best available. His first reign lasted exactly 2 months. John Hunyadi, the Hungarian regent who had backed his father's murderers, assembled an army and marched south. The White Knight of Wallachia was determined to prevent any Ottoman puppet from ruling the principality. The Battle of Turgovite in December 1448 was less a military engagement than a political statement. Vlad's Ottoman-backed forces were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Hunyadi's experienced army. But the real defeat was not military but psychological. The Wallachian people, including many of Vlad's own soldiers, refused to fight for a prince they saw as a traitor. Vlad fled across the Danube. His first attempt at kingship ended in humiliation. But even in defeat, he had learned valuable lessons. He had seen how quickly loyalty could shift, how important perception was in medieval politics, how necessary it was to control not just territory but the narrative that defined legitimacy. Most importantly, he had learned that being right was less important than being effective. His father had tried to balance between empires and died for his moderation. Vlad would not make the same mistake when he returned to power. It would be on his own terms, backed by his own strength, owing loyalty to no one but himself. The boy who had entered Ottoman captivity as a hostage had been transformed into something far more dangerous. A prince who understood that in a world without mercy, mercy itself was a form of suicide. His education was complete. Now came the test. After his humiliating defeat at Turgovite, Vlad found himself a prince without a kingdom, a ruler without subjects, a dragon without a lair. The Ottoman Empire had invested in his restoration and received nothing in return. Hungary controlled Wallachia through a puppet ruler, and Vlad himself was now a political refugee, too dangerous to be ignored but too weak to be feared. His first refuge was Moldavia, ruled by his uncle Bogdan II, but even family ties provided no security in 15th-century Eastern Europe. Bogdan had his own problems with Hungarian interference and Ottoman pressure. Harboring a failed Ottoman puppet could bring disaster to his own principality. The court at Suceava was a harsh education in political reality. Vlad watched his uncle navigate the same impossible choices his father had faced, making the same compromises, accepting the same humiliations. The difference was that Bogdan had learned to survive by becoming indispensable to everyone and committed to no one. But survival through usefulness was a fragile strategy. In 1451, Bogdan II was assassinated by his own boyars, who had been promised Hungarian support for a more compliant ruler. The murder was carried out during a state banquet, with knives hidden in the sleeves of guests who had eaten at the prince's table for years. Vlad escaped the massacre by minutes, fleeing into the forests of Moldavia with a handful of loyal followers. The 19-year-old prince had now witnessed the murders of his father, his uncle, and his eldest brother. The lesson was unmistakable. In his world, trust was a luxury that could be fatal. The next 3 years were a masterclass in survival. Vlad moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked down. He lived in monasteries, mountain caves, and peasant villages. He learned to speak like a commoner, to dress like a merchant, to blend into crowds like a ghost, but he was not hiding, he was learning. Vlad used his exile to study his homeland from the ground up. He lived among the peasants who formed the backbone of Wallachian society and learned their concerns, their fears, their hopes. He saw how the constant warfare between empires had devastated the countryside, how the boyars' political games had enriched the nobility while impoverishing everyone else. Most importantly, he learned how the common people really felt about their rulers. The peasants had no loyalty to abstract concepts like Christianity or Islam, Hungary or Ottoman Empire. They supported whoever could protect them from bandits, keep the trade routes open, and maintain some semblance of order. This was a revelation that would shape Vlad's entire approach to governance. The boyars who had murdered his father and uncle cared about their own wealth and status. The foreign powers who competed for influence in Wallachia cared about tribute and strategic advantage, but the people who actually lived in the principality cared about security, justice, and predictability. During his exile, Vlad also cultivated relationships with other displaced nobles, mercenary captains, and ambitious clergy. He learned to recognize useful people, to remember favors and slights, to build networks of obligation that could be activated when the time came. The most important relationship was with Stephen the Great, who had recently become Prince of Moldavia after his own father's assassination. Stephen was everything Vlad was not: charismatic, diplomatic, genuinely religious. But he was also pragmatic enough to understand that survival required allies, and ambitious enough to see opportunity in chaos. Stephen offered Vlad more than sanctuary, he offered partnership. Together they could create a confederation of Orthodox principalities strong enough to resist both Ottoman and Hungarian pressure. But the alliance required patience, careful planning, and perfect timing. The opportunity came in 1456, when John Hunyadi died of plague after his victory at the siege of Belgrade. The White Knight's death created a power vacuum in Hungary, as his 15-year-old son Matthias Corvinus struggled to consolidate power without the Holy Crown of Hungary. Vlad saw his chance. A weak Hungary meant reduced support for his enemies in Wallachia. A young Hungarian king meant opportunities for new alliances, and his own experience as a hostage had taught him how to appear useful to powerful patrons while pursuing his own agenda. But this time, Vlad would not repeat his father's mistakes. He would not try to balance between empires, he would use them against each other. He would not trust in the loyalty of nobles, he would create his own power base among the common people, and he would not show mercy to enemies who had shown none to his family. The prince who emerged from exile was not the same desperate teenager who had fled to Moldavia. 7 years of humiliation, betrayal, and survival had forged him into something harder and more dangerous. He had learned that in a world without rules, the only crime was failure. August 1456. The road to Trgovite was lined with the bodies of Vlad's enemies, but this time he was not backed by Ottoman armies or Hungarian gold. This time he came with something more powerful, the promise of order in a land that had forgotten what peace looked like. The political situation in Wallachia had become chaos. The Hungarian-backed prince had been murdered by his own boyars, who had then been murdered by their rivals, who had then been murdered by Turkish raiders. In the 8 years since Vlad's first reign, the principality had seen 6 different rulers, none of whom had lasted more than 2 years. This instability had devastated the country. Trade routes were controlled by bandits. Tax collection had collapsed. The boyars had divided the realm into private fiefdoms, each ruled by warlords who acknowledged no authority beyond their own castles. The Ottoman Empire had begun treating Wallachia as a conquered territory, sending tax collectors backed by janissary units. Into this chaos came Vlad Dracula III, no longer a boy but a man of 25, who had spent nearly half his life studying the arts of survival and revenge. He had learned patience from his years of exile, ruthlessness from his years of humiliation, and the value of terror from his years among the Ottomans. But he had also learned something more important, the difference between being feared and being respected. His first reign had failed because he had been seen as a foreign puppet. His second reign would succeed because he would be seen as a national savior. Vlad's first act was to invite all the surviving boyars to a feast at Trgovite. The invitation was phrased as a request, but everyone understood it was a command. The nobles who had spent 8 years murdering each other suddenly found themselves face to face with a prince who remembered every betrayal, every collaboration, every act of treason. The feast began traditionally, with prayers and toasts and the elaborate courtesies of medieval diplomacy. But as the wine flowed and the nobles relaxed, Vlad rose to address his guests. His speech was simple, direct, and terrifying in its implications. "How many princes have you seen rule in Wallachia?" he asked. The question seemed innocent enough. The oldest boyar, proud of his longevity and political survival, boasted of serving under 7 different rulers. Others competed with their own numbers, each trying to demonstrate his importance by listing the princes he had outlived. Vlad listened to each answer with apparent interest, nodding and asking follow-up questions. Some claimed to have served under 20 different princes, others boasted of remembering 30 or 40 rulers. The most senior nobles treated the question as an opportunity to demonstrate their indispensability. When the last boyar had finished speaking, Vlad smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "You have destroyed the continuity of this land," he said quietly. "You have made princes into beggars and beggars into princes. You have sold your loyalty to the highest bidder and your souls to the most convenient master. You are not nobles. You are parasites, and parasites must be removed before they kill their host." What happened next became the foundation of Vlad's reputation for cruelty. The older boyars, those who had admitted to serving the most princes, were dragged from the feast and impaled on stakes in the courtyard. They died slowly in full view of the castle, their screams serving as a soundtrack to the revolution that was beginning. The younger nobles were given a different fate. They were marched to the ruins of Poenary Castle, high in the mountains, and forced to rebuild it stone by stone. They worked in chains, without tools, carrying massive blocks of limestone up treacherous mountain paths. They worked until their clothes rotted off their bodies and their hands bled through to the bone. But this was not random violence. It was surgical brutality designed to achieve specific political goals. The old boyars who had spent decades switching sides were eliminated, removing the source of political instability. The younger nobles were transformed from independent power brokers into personal servants of the prince, their survival dependent on his continued favor. The message was clear to everyone who witnessed it. Loyalty to Vlad was the only loyalty that mattered. The age of noble independence was over. The age of absolute monarchy had begun, but Vlad understood that terror alone was not enough to maintain power. The execution of the boyars was followed by a systematic campaign to rebuild the institutions of government. New nobles were appointed from among the lesser gentry, men who owed their positions entirely to the prince's favor. The army was reorganized around personal loyalty rather than feudal obligation. The tax system was reformed to bypass the traditional noble intermediaries. Most importantly, Vlad began to cultivate a new image of himself as the defender of the common people against noble oppression. The same boyars who had been impaled for their disloyalty were posthumously condemned for their exploitation of peasants. The prince who had terrorized the nobility was presented as the protector of the poor. This was more than propaganda. It was a fundamental shift in the nature of monarchy. Instead of ruling through the consent of the nobles, Vlad would rule through the support of the people. Instead of being the first among equals, he would be the absolute sovereign whose word was law. The transformation was remarkably successful. Within months, Wallachia had gone from chaos to order, from anarchy to absolute monarchy. The roads were safe, the borders were secure, and the tribute was being paid on time. The price was the complete elimination of political opposition and the establishment of a reign of terror that would make Vlad's name synonymous with cruelty. But the boyars were just the beginning. Vlad had learned that to maintain absolute power, he would need to eliminate all potential sources of opposition. The merchants who had grown rich on corruption, the foreign traders who showed no respect for Wallachian law, the priests who preached submission to foreign powers, all would feel the weight of his justice. The reign of terror was not the product of madness but of calculation. Vlad had studied the methods of every successful tyrant in history, from the Roman emperors to the Ottoman sultans. He understood that fear was the most reliable foundation for order, that uncertainty was the enemy of stability, that mercy was a luxury that weak rulers could not afford. The boy who had been shaped by betrayal and humiliation was now reshaping his entire kingdom in his own image. The dragon had returned to its lair, and everything that had wounded it would be destroyed. By 1458, Vlad had eliminated the traditional boyar class and established his personal monopoly on power, but this was only the beginning of his transformation of Wallachian society. The prince who had been educated in Ottoman methods of control was now applying those lessons to create something unprecedented in European history, a state based entirely on fear. The system Vlad created was breathtakingly comprehensive. Every aspect of society was reorganized around a single principle: absolute obedience to the prince. Merchants who cheated their customers were impaled alongside their goods. Priests who preached against the government were burned alive in their own churches. Foreign ambassadors who failed to show proper respect were nailed to their caps and sent home as warnings. But the most famous element of Vlad's reign was the forest of stakes that surrounded Turgovite. Impalement was not a new form of execution. It had been used throughout history by various cultures. But Vlad perfected it as an instrument of psychological warfare, turning execution into performance art designed to terrorize potential enemies. The process was carefully choreographed for maximum impact. Victims were stripped and forced to sit on sharpened stakes that were then raised upright. The stakes were positioned to avoid vital organs, ensuring that death would be slow and agonizing. The impaled victims could survive for hours, sometimes days, conscious and screaming while their bodies slowly slid down the wooden spears. The stakes were arranged in geometric patterns visible from great distances. Travelers approaching the capital would see the forest of bodies long before they reached the city walls. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. This was what happened to those who opposed Vlad Dracula III. But the horror was not random. Vlad used impalement with surgical precision, targeting specific categories of enemies to send specific messages. Ottoman tax collectors were impaled to demonstrate rejection of foreign authority. Corrupt officials were impaled to show that justice applied to everyone. Foreign merchants were impaled to establish that Wallachian law took precedence over international custom. The most famous incident involved two Turkish envoys who refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, claiming it was against their religion. Vlad's response was characteristic. "Then let me help you keep your custom forever." The turbans were nailed to their heads with iron spikes, and the envoys were sent back to Constantinople as living examples of what happened to those who showed disrespect to the Prince of Wallachia. The stories spread across Europe like wildfire. German merchants reported seeing 20,000 impaled bodies outside Tergovite. Venetian diplomats wrote of forests of stakes stretching to the horizon. Hungarian nobles spoke of dining halls where Vlad feasted among the corpses of his enemies, dipping his bread in their blood. Many of these stories were exaggerated, but the core truth was undeniable. Vlad had created a system where terror was not just an instrument of punishment but a method of governance. The threat of impalement became so effective that crime virtually disappeared from Wallachia. A famous story tells of a golden cup left in the main square of Tergovite that remained untouched for years because no one dared steal it. This was terror as statecraft, cruelty as policy, fear as the foundation of order. But Vlad understood that horror without justice would eventually provoke rebellion. The victims of his terror were carefully chosen to represent categories of behavior that the common people already despised: corrupt officials, foreign exploiters, noble oppressors. The result was a strange form of popular tyranny. The same prince who terrorized the nobility was seen by the peasants as a protector of the poor. The same man who filled forests with impaled bodies was praised by the common people for creating the most law-abiding state in Europe. But Vlad's greatest innovation was the democratization of terror. Unlike previous tyrants who had relied on secret police and private executioners, Vlad made his brutality public, visible, and participatory. The people of Wallachia were not just subjects of his terror, they were witnesses to it, participants in it, and ultimately complicit in it. This created a psychological dynamic that was almost impossible to break. The people who had watched their neighbors being impaled found themselves invested in the system that had created those executions. To admit that Vlad's methods were wrong would mean admitting their own complicity in those methods. The prince, who had been shaped by betrayal and humiliation, had created a kingdom where betrayal was impossible because the price was too high to pay. He had transformed Wallachia from a chaotic principality into a perfectly ordered police state, held together by the simple understanding that disobedience meant death. But this perfection came at a terrible cost. The same methods that had eliminated crime and corruption had also eliminated creativity, innovation, and independent thought. The same fear that had created order had also created a society of slaves, united only by their shared terror of their ruler. By 1459, Vlad had achieved what no previous Wallachian prince had managed: complete control over his kingdom. But control was not the same as security. The Ottoman Empire was still expanding, Hungary was still interfering in Wallachian affairs, and the European powers were still treating his principality as a pawn in their larger games. The system of terror that had worked so well against internal enemies was about to face its greatest test: external war. The prince who had perfected the art of domestic tyranny was about to discover whether his methods could protect his kingdom from the greatest empire in the world. The stage was set for the confrontation that would define Vlad's legacy. The student was about to face his former teachers, and the weapons would be the same ones they had taught him to use: fear, brutality, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive. The complaints reached Constantinople from across the empire. Wallachian merchants were being impaled for supposedly cheating Ottoman customers. Turkish tax collectors were returning to their posts in pieces, their severed heads delivered in silk bags with messages expressing Vlad's regrets that they had been unable to complete their duties. But the most serious provocation came in the spring of 1459, when Vlad did something that no Christian prince had dared attempt for decades. He stopped paying tribute to the Sultan. The annual tribute of 10,000 gold ducats had been the cornerstone of Ottoman-Wallachian relations for nearly 20 years. It was not just money, it was a symbol of submission, a recognition that Wallachia existed only at the pleasure of Constantinople. When Vlad's envoys arrived at the Ottoman court not with gold but with a letter explaining that the tribute would be temporarily delayed due to administrative reorganization, the insult was unmistakable. Mehmed's response was measured but ominous. He sent his most trusted diplomat, Hamza Pasha, to Turgovite with a simple message. The tribute would be paid with interest or there would be consequences. The Sultan also demanded that Vlad come to Constantinople personally to explain his recent behavior. The meeting between Hamza Pasha and Vlad took place in the Great Hall of the Wallachian Palace, surrounded by the same impaled stakes that had terrified the boyars. The Ottoman diplomat, a man who had negotiated with kings and emperors, found himself face to face with a prince who seemed to have no understanding of the balance of power. "The Sultan is displeased," Hamza Pasha began, using the traditional diplomatic language of veiled threats. He wonders why his faithful vassal has forgotten his obligations. Vlad's response was characteristic in its directness. "I have forgotten nothing. I remember every lesson your people taught me. I remember every humiliation, every betrayal, every moment of my education in your palaces, and I have learned those lessons well." The Ottoman diplomat tried to explain the realities of power. The empire had armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Wallachia had perhaps 30,000 fighting men. The Sultan commanded the loyalty of dozens of provinces. Vlad ruled a principality that could be crossed in 3 days' hard riding. But Vlad was no longer thinking in terms of conventional military logic. He had spent 5 years perfecting a system of terror that had transformed his kingdom from chaos to order. He had learned that fear was more powerful than numbers, that psychological warfare was more effective than traditional battlefields. "Your Sultan commands many men," Vlad replied, "but I command something more powerful, the willingness to do what others will not. When your armies come, and they will come, they will find that the student has become the teacher." The negotiations continued for 3 days, but it was clear that no compromise was possible. Vlad had crossed a line that no vassal prince had crossed before. He was not just refusing tribute, he was challenging the entire Ottoman system of control. Hamza Pasha's final offer was generous by Ottoman standards. Vlad could keep his throne if he came to Constantinople to pay homage and agreed to resume tribute payments. The alternative was war against the greatest military power in the world. Vlad's response became legendary throughout Europe. He invited the Ottoman delegation to a farewell feast, where he served them on golden plates and offered them the finest wines from his cellars. As the meal concluded, he rose to make a toast. "To the Sultan," he said, raising his goblet, "who taught me that power belongs to those who are willing to take it. And to his faithful servant Hamza Pasha, who has delivered his message so eloquently." The Ottoman diplomat relaxed, believing that the toast signaled acceptance of the Sultan's terms, but Vlad was not finished. "I regret that I cannot accept the Sultan's generous invitation to visit Constantinople," he continued, "but I will send representatives who can speak for me more eloquently than words." The representatives turned out to be the severed heads of every Ottoman tax collector who had entered Wallachia in the previous year. They were presented to Hamza Pasha in ornate boxes, each head carefully preserved and positioned to face Constantinople. "Please assure the Sultan," Vlad concluded, "that his faithful student remembers all his lessons, and that the dragon has learned to breathe fire." The declaration of war was implicit but unmistakable. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the Sultan who had expanded the Ottoman Empire to its greatest extent, now faced something unprecedented. A Christian vassal who was not just rebelling but actively challenging the psychological foundations of Ottoman power. The Sultan's response was swift and overwhelming. In the spring of 1462, he assembled an army of 90,000 men, janissaries, sipahis, irregular troops, and artillery units that had proven their effectiveness against the walls of Constantinople. The force was commanded by Mehmed himself, a clear indication that this was not just a punitive expedition but a war of imperial prestige. The contrast between the two armies was stark. The Ottoman force included some of the most advanced military technology in the world. Massive cannons that could breach any fortification, engineers who had perfected the art of siege warfare, and disciplined infantry units that had conquered half of Europe. Against this, Vlad could muster perhaps 30,000 men, most of them peasant levies armed with whatever weapons they could find. But Vlad had never intended to fight a conventional war. The years of studying Ottoman military manuals had taught him that the empire's strength lay in its ability to bring overwhelming force to bear on traditional battlefields. The solution was simple: avoid traditional battlefields entirely. As the Ottoman army crossed the Danube in early June 1462, they entered a nightmare landscape that seemed designed to break their morale. The countryside had been systematically devastated by Vlad's own forces. Every village was burned, every well was poisoned, every bridge was destroyed. The fields were salted, the livestock were slaughtered, and the population had vanished into the mountains. This was scorched earth warfare taken to its logical extreme. The Ottoman army found itself marching through a wasteland where nothing could live and nothing could be found. Their supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles, became vulnerable to constant harassment by Wallachian forces who seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. But the psychological warfare was even more effective than the physical destruction. The roads were lined with impaled Ottoman prisoners, their screams audible for miles. The stakes were arranged in patterns that formed messages visible from great distances. "Welcome to Wallachia," written in the bodies of Turkish soldiers. The Ottoman army, which had conquered cities and crushed kingdoms, found itself terrorized by an enemy they could not see and could not catch. The Janissaries, elite troops who had stormed the walls of Constantinople, were afraid to venture far from their camps. The horses, sensing the fear of their riders, became skittish and unmanageable. Mehmed II, accustomed to the psychological advantages of overwhelming force, found himself facing an opponent who seemed immune to intimidation. The Sultan, who had struck terror into the hearts of emperors, was now confronting a prince who had made terror into an art form. The climax came on the night of June 17, 1462. The Ottoman army had made camp in a valley outside Turgovite, confident that their numbers and discipline would protect them from any attack. The camp was professionally organized, with sentries posted, trenches dug, and artillery positioned to command the approaches. But Vlad had spent months preparing for this moment. He had studied the Ottoman military manuals, analyzed their camping procedures, and identified the weaknesses in their defensive systems. More importantly, he had trained his forces in a type of warfare that the Ottomans had never encountered: total psychological warfare. The attack began at midnight with a sound that none of the Ottoman soldiers had heard before: the synchronized screaming of 10,000 Wallachian warriors. The noise was designed not just to signal the attack but to create maximum terror. The screams were human but somehow inhuman, the sound of men who had been transformed into instruments of horror. The Wallachian forces struck the Ottoman camp from every direction simultaneously. But this was not a conventional assault designed to capture ground or destroy equipment. It was a terror raid designed to break the psychological foundation of Ottoman military confidence. The attackers moved through the camp like demons, not trying to hold territory but to create maximum chaos and fear. They targeted the officers' tents, the artillery positions, and the supply trains. But most importantly, they targeted the Sultan himself. Vlad personally led a force of 200 picked men in a direct assault on Mehmed's tent. The attack came within yards of succeeding. The Sultan was awakened by the screams of his bodyguards and escaped only because a loyal Janissary threw himself between the Ottoman Emperor and Vlad I's sword. The night attack lasted only 2 hours, but its psychological impact was devastating. The Ottoman army, which had conquered half of Europe, had been penetrated and terrorized by a force 1/3 its size. The Sultan, who had never known defeat, had been forced to flee his own tent in his nightclothes. When dawn broke, the Ottoman camp was in chaos. Hundreds of soldiers were dead, not from conventional battle wounds, but from the terror-induced panic that had swept through the ranks. Equipment was scattered, horses were running wild, and the morale of the entire army was shattered. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. In the pre-dawn darkness, Vlad's forces had arranged a new forest of stakes around the Ottoman camp. The impaled bodies were all wearing Ottoman uniforms, all facing toward the Sultan's tent, all positioned to be visible at first light. The message was clear: the student had become the master. The prince who had learned terror from the Ottomans was now teaching them lessons they had never imagined possible. The night attack on the Ottoman camp was a tactical masterpiece that reverberated across 2 continents. Vlad had achieved something that no Christian prince had managed in living memory. He had struck terror into the heart of the Ottoman Empire and forced the Sultan himself to flee in panic. The immediate aftermath of the attack was extraordinary. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the Sultan who had expanded Ottoman power to its zenith, was reduced to a shaken refugee in his own camp. His bodyguards found him hours after the attack, still trembling from the encounter with Vlad's sword. The man who had terrorized Europe now knew what it felt like to be prey. But the victory was more than tactical, it was transformational. For the first time in decades, a Christian prince had not just resisted Ottoman expansion but had actively humiliated the empire's greatest sultan. The psychological impact rippled through the Ottoman military hierarchy like a shockwave. The Janissaries, elite troops who had stormed the walls of Byzantium, began to whisper among themselves about the Wallachian demon who could penetrate any defense. The Sipahis, cavalry units that had conquered the Balkans, started to avoid patrol duties in the forests around Turgovite. Even the Sultan's personal bodyguard, men selected for their absolute loyalty and fearlessness, began to show signs of nervous exhaustion. Within the Ottoman camp, discipline began to crack. Soldiers who had campaigned from Vienna to Baghdad spoke of requesting transfers to any front except Wallachia. Supply convoys refused to travel without massive escorts. The psychological dominance that had made Ottoman conquest so efficient was crumbling in the face of an enemy who seemed to embody their deepest fears. The victory brought Vlad something he had never possessed before: genuine respect from his own people. The boyars who had been terrorized into submission now saw their prince as something more than a tyrant. He was a national hero who had accomplished the impossible. The peasants who had lived in fear of Ottoman tax collectors now celebrated. A ruler who had driven the Sultan himself from their soil. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Vlad experienced what it meant to be loved rather than merely feared. The same villages that had been forced to build his fortresses now volunteered labor for his war effort. The same merchants who had been impaled for cheating now contributed their wealth freely to the defense of the realm. The same priests who had been burned for disloyalty now preached sermons celebrating him as God's instrument against the infidel. But the victory brought Vlad something even more valuable. It proved that his methods worked. The system of terror that had seemed like madness to European observers had achieved what diplomacy and conventional warfare had failed to accomplish. The prince who had been dismissed as a blood-drunk tyrant had demonstrated that calculated brutality could defeat even the greatest empire in the world. The psychological transformation in Vlad himself was profound. The boy who had been humiliated in Ottoman courts, the young man who had lived in constant fear of assassination, the prince who had spent his first reign looking over his shoulder, all of these versions of himself were finally laid to rest. In their place stood a man who had proven that he could not only survive but triumph against impossible odds. But terror, as Vlad was about to discover, was a weapon that cut both ways. The same methods that had intimidated the Ottomans had also horrified his potential allies. The European powers, who should have been celebrating his victory, were instead recoiling in disgust from his methods. The reports that reached the courts of Europe were detailed and devastating. Venetian merchants described forests of impaled bodies stretching to the horizon. Hungarian nobles spoke of dining halls where Vlad feasted among corpses. German chroniclers wrote of a prince who had become a monster, drunk on blood and addicted to cruelty. These stories were often exaggerated, but they served the political interests of rulers who had no desire to support a vassal who might use similar methods against them. The same terror that had driven back the Ottomans was now isolating Vlad from the Christian world. The immediate military consequences were even more serious. Mehmed II, humiliated by the night attack, was now personally committed to Vlad's destruction. The Sultan who had conquered Constantinople was not going to be defeated by a Wallachian prince, regardless of the cost. The Ottoman response was swift and overwhelming. Fresh armies were assembled, new supply lines were established, and the entire resources of the empire were mobilized for a single purpose: the complete destruction of Vlad Dracula III and everything he represented. But Vlad had also learned something crucial from his victory. Terror was most effective when it was unexpected. The Ottomans had been shocked by his methods precisely because they had never encountered them before. Now that they understood his tactics, they could prepare countermeasures. The psychological advantage that had carried him through the night attack was evaporating. The Ottoman soldiers, initially terrified by the impaled bodies and the screaming attacks, were beginning to adapt. Terror, like any weapon, became less effective with repetition. More importantly, Vlad's own forces were beginning to crack under the pressure. The same methods that had disciplined the boyars and terrified the Ottomans were now being used to maintain order among troops who were vastly outnumbered and increasingly desperate. The peasant levies who had followed him into battle were beginning to desert. The minor nobles who had supported his revolution were beginning to question whether victory was possible. The people who had cheered his establishment of order were beginning to wonder if the price of that order was too high to pay. The immediate consequences of Vlad's reign were devastating, but the long-term impact on Romanian identity was profound and lasting. To understand Vlad's true historical significance, we must look beyond the sensational stories of impalement and examine what he represented to the people of Wallachia and later to the Romanian national consciousness. In the immediate aftermath of his final defeat, Vlad's methods were almost universally condemned. European chroniclers portrayed him as a monster, Ottoman historians depicted him as a mad dog, and even some of his own subjects seemed relieved to see him gone. But within a generation, something remarkable began to happen. The monster began to transform into a martyr. The key to this transformation lay in what Vlad had actually accomplished. During his brief reign, for the first time in decades, Wallachia had experienced genuine independence. The tribute that had drained the country's wealth was stopped. The Ottoman officials who had treated Wallachian nobles as servants were driven out or killed. The Hungarian interference that had destabilized the region was ended through sheer force of will. More importantly, Vlad had demonstrated that resistance to foreign domination was possible. The psychological barrier that had made Ottoman expansion seem inevitable was broken. The prince who had been educated to be a compliant vassal had instead shown that even the greatest empire in the world could be challenged by a determined ruler willing to pay any price for independence. This lesson resonated far beyond Wallachia's borders. Throughout the Ottoman Empire, Christian populations began to speak of the Wallachian prince who had made the Sultan flee in terror. The stories grew in the telling, transforming Vlad from a historical figure into a symbol of resistance against foreign oppression. But it was in the Romanian territories that Vlad's impact was most profound. The three principalities of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania had been politically fragmented and culturally divided for centuries. They shared language and customs, but they had never shared a common political identity. Vlad's reign began to change that. The prince who had unified Wallachia through terror became, in death, a symbol of what Romanian unity could achieve. His brief success in driving back the Ottomans was remembered as proof that the Romanian people could govern themselves if they could overcome their internal divisions. The tyrant who had eliminated political opposition became, in historical memory, the strong leader who had put national interest above personal ambition. This transformation of Vlad's reputation was not accidental. It was driven by the concrete needs of later generations. As Ottoman control over the Romanian territories tightened, the need for heroes who had successfully resisted foreign domination became increasingly important. Vlad's methods were forgotten or rationalized. His achievement in challenging the Sultan was remembered and celebrated. The process accelerated during the 18th and 19th centuries as Romanian national consciousness began to emerge. Intellectuals and political leaders searching for historical precedents for independence found in Vlad a figure who embodied their aspirations. The prince who had been condemned as a monster was rehabilitated as a patriot who had sacrificed everything for his country's freedom. This nationalist interpretation of Vlad's legacy was historically problematic. It ignored the reality of his methods and exaggerated the extent of his achievements, but it served a crucial psychological function for a people who had been dominated by foreign powers for centuries. Vlad became proof that Romanians could produce leaders capable of standing up to the greatest empires in the world. The impact on Romanian political culture was profound and lasting. The idea that strong leadership justified extreme methods became embedded in the national political consciousness. The belief that foreign interference was the primary threat to Romanian independence shaped diplomatic and military thinking for centuries. Even more importantly, Vlad's example provided a template for how Romanian leaders should behave in times of crisis. The willingness to use any means necessary to preserve independence, the rejection of foreign pressure regardless of the consequences, the belief that national survival justified personal sacrifice, all of these became central elements of Romanian political culture. This legacy was not always positive. The same glorification of strong leadership that made Vlad a national hero also contributed to the acceptance of authoritarian rule in later periods. The same emphasis on resistance to foreign influence that celebrated his independence also fostered xenophobia and isolation. The same admiration for his ruthless methods that turned him into a symbol of patriotism also normalized political violence. But for all its problematic aspects, Vlad's legacy provided something that the Romanian people desperately needed, a sense of their own agency in history. The prince who had been shaped by foreign domination became, in historical memory, proof that Romanians could shape their own destiny. The tyrant who had terrorized his subjects became the symbol of their capacity for self-governance. From the perspective of a historian, Vlad Dracula III represents one of the most complex and contradictory figures in European history. His reign lasted only 6 years, but its impact on Romanian identity, European politics, and the Ottoman Empire was profound and lasting. The scholarly consensus on Vlad has evolved significantly over the past century. Early historians, influenced by German and Ottoman sources, portrayed him as a sadistic tyrant whose cruelty served no rational purpose. Mid-20th century Romanian historians, writing during the communist period, transformed him into a proto-nationalist hero who had defended his country against foreign oppression. The modern historical assessment is more nuanced. Vlad was undoubtedly brutal, but his brutality was not random or pathological. It was systematic and purposeful. He used terror as an instrument of state policy, applying it with surgical precision to achieve specific political goals. In this sense, he was less a medieval tyrant than a proto-modern dictator who understood the psychological foundations of power. His methods were effective in the short term. Within 3 years of taking power, he had eliminated political opposition, restored order, and established the most centralized government in Wallachian history. His military campaigns, while ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated that even the Ottoman Empire could be challenged by a determined and intelligent opponent. But the long-term costs were enormous. The system of terror that he created poisoned Wallachian political culture for generations. The elimination of the traditional nobility left a vacuum that was filled by foreign-imposed administrators. The isolation from European allies that resulted from his methods left Wallachia vulnerable to future Ottoman conquest. Perhaps most importantly, Vlad's reign demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of terror as a political instrument. He showed that fear could create order, eliminate opposition, and even achieve military victories against superior forces. But he also showed that terror could not create loyalty, inspire sacrifice, or build the kind of lasting institutions that outlive their creators. The comparison with other historical figures is instructive. Like Stalin, Vlad used systematic terror to transform a backward society, but unlike Stalin, he lacked the time and resources to institutionalize his revolution. Like Cromwell, he destroyed traditional political structures in the name of national independence, but unlike Cromwell, he failed to create viable alternatives. What makes Vlad unique in European history is not his cruelty. Medieval Europe produced many cruel rulers, but his systematic approach to terror and his success in using it to challenge a major empire. He was, in many ways, the first modern dictator, applying methods that would not be seen again until the 20th century. His historical significance lies not in his personality or his methods, but in what he represented, the collision between medieval and modern concepts of power. He lived at a time when personal rule was giving way to institutional government, when religious authority was being challenged by secular power, when local autonomy was being destroyed by imperial expansion. Vlad's response to these challenges was characteristically extreme. He embraced absolute power as the only alternative to foreign domination. The prince, who had been educated to be a compliant vassal, became instead the architect of his own empire, built on the simple principle that survival required the elimination of all opposition. Whether this response was justified depends on one's perspective. From a Romanian nationalist viewpoint, Vlad was a heroic figure who sacrificed everything to preserve his country's independence. From a broader European perspective, he was a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the costs of political extremism. But from the perspective of historical analysis, Vlad Dracula III was something more significant. He was a preview of the kind of rulers who would dominate the modern world. The prince who perfected the art of terror in a medieval kingdom was, in many ways, the first of the great dictators who would shape the 20th century. His legacy is complex and contradictory, but it is undeniably important. The boy who had been shaped by betrayal and humiliation became the man who reshaped an entire kingdom in his own image. The dragon had returned to his lair, and the world has never forgotten the fire he breathed.